The boy on stage repeated his father's final words. Simon Cowell froze. His hand shot up to stop the music, and he stood up from the judge's table. America's Got Talent. Tuesday night. The Pasadena Civic Auditorium packed with 3,000 people. Cameras rolling. Millions watching from home. Another audition in a season full of singers, dancers, magicians, and dreamers. The stage lights came up on a 12-year-old boy standing alone under the spotlight. His name was Ethan Miller. Brown hair, neatly combed. Khaki pants and a button-down shirt that looked slightly too big, like maybe it had been his father's. He held the microphone with both hands, gripping it so tightly his knuckles were white. Host Terry Crews walked over with his usual warmth. "Hey there, young man! What's your name?" "Ethan Miller." "And how old are you, Ethan?" 12. 12? And what are you going to do for us today?" Ethan looked down at the microphone, then back up at the judge's table where Simon Cowell sat in his usual position, arms crossed, expression neutral, waiting to be impressed or disappointed. "I'm going to sing," Ethan said quietly. "A song my dad taught me." Terry smiled. "That's wonderful. Is your dad here tonight?" Ethan's grip on the microphone tightened. "No, sir. He died 4 months ago." The energy in the auditorium shifted immediately. The casual pre-performance buzz died. 3,000 people went quiet. The judges all leaned forward slightly. Simon's arms uncrossed. "I'm so sorry to hear that," Terry said gently, crouching down to Ethan's level. "What was your dad's name?" "Daniel Miller. He was a firefighter." Ethan's voice cracked slightly. "He died responding to a warehouse fire in March." Terry put a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "He was a hero." "Yes, sir." Ethan looked directly at Simon Cowell. "Before my dad died, he made me promise him something. He said, 'Ethan, you have a gift. Don't waste it being afraid. Get on that stage and show them what you can do.' Those were the last words he said to me before they took him to the hospital." The boy on stage repeated his father's last words and Simon Cowell froze completely, his hand raised to stop everything, standing up from the judge's desk. Simon didn't move. Didn't blink. His hand was halfway raised as if to gesture, but it hung there, suspended. His face had transformed from his typical evaluative expression to something raw and unguarded. The other judges noticed. Howie Mandel looked at Simon with concern. Heidi Klum's hand went to her heart. Sofia Vergara had tears already forming in her eyes. But Simon just stared at this 12-year-old boy holding a microphone like a lifeline, trying to honor a promise made to a dying father. "What was the promise?" Simon asked, his voice rough, barely above his normal speaking volume but somehow carrying through the entire theater. Ethan met his eyes. "That I would audition for America's Got Talent. That I would stand on this stage and sing. My dad watched the show every week. He said you changed people's lives. He said you were tough but fair. And he wanted me to sing for you." Simon stood up. Not the casual standing he sometimes did during performances. This was different. Deliberate. He stepped out from behind the judge's desk and walked toward the stage. The audience gasped. In the show's entire run, Simon had rarely left the judge's table during an audition introduction. The other judges looked at each other, uncertain what was happening. Terry Crews stepped back, giving Simon space. Simon walked to the edge of the stage, standing just below where Ethan was positioned. He looked up at the boy, and when he spoke, his voice had none of its usual sharp edge. It was gentle. Human. "Ethan, before you sing, I need to tell you something. And I need everyone here to understand something." He turned to face the audience, then back to Ethan. "Your father was right. This show has changed lives. But what you're doing right now, standing on this stage 4 months after losing your dad, trying to keep a promise you made to him, that takes more courage than anything we've seen on this stage. Do you understand that?" Ethan nodded, tears streaming down his face now. "So before you sing," Simon continued, I want you to know that you've already honored your father. You've already kept your promise. You're here. That's enough." Simon stopped the show. No one knew what was happening. The music director, who had been preparing to cue the track, looked confused. The producers in the control room were frantically talking into headsets. This wasn't how auditions worked. Contestants came out, they performed, the judges gave feedback. There was a rhythm, a structure. Simon was breaking all of it. "What song are you singing?" Simon asked. "You Raise Me Up," Ethan said quietly. "It was my dad's favorite. He used to sing it to me when I was scared of something." Simon closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were glistening. "Do you know why your father loved that song?" Ethan shook his head. "Because it's about finding strength in the people who believe in you, even when they're not physically with you anymore. Your father knew he might not always be here. So he gave you that song. And he gave you this dream. Not because he wanted you to be famous, but because he wanted you to know you were strong enough to do hard things." The audience was completely silent. 3,000 people bearing witness to something that transcended entertainment. Simon looked at the other judges. "I'm going to do something we don't normally do. Ethan, I want you to sing. But before you do, I want to make you a promise. The same way your father made you a promise." "What promise?" Ethan whispered. "That no matter what happens with your audition, no matter what the other judges say, you're going to know that your father was right about you. You're going to know that you have something special. And you're going to know that keeping promises, even hard ones, is what makes you the kind of man your father raised you to be." Ethan was crying openly now. So was most of the audience. Howie had his head in his hands. Heidi was wiping tears with tissues. Sophia was clutching her chest. Simon turned to the music director. "Start the track." To understand why Simon Cowell reacted this way, you need to understand something about Simon that very few people know. In 1999, before Simon was famous, before American Idol, before he became the most recognized television judge in the world, his father died suddenly of a heart attack. Simon had been in the middle of building his music career, working brutal hours, taking risks, and his father, Eric Cowell, had been his biggest supporter. Eric had told Simon the same thing Ethan's father had told him. "You have a gift. Don't waste it being afraid." Simon had been planning to visit his father that weekend. He was going to tell him about a new project he was working on. He never got the chance. Eric died on a Thursday afternoon, and Simon spent the next decade building a television empire while carrying the weight of promises made to a father he'd never see again. When Ethan Miller walked onto that stage and repeated his father's final words, words that echoed Simon's own father's message, it was like looking into a mirror that showed him his 12-year-old self, standing alone, trying to be brave, trying to honor someone who was gone. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this performance is still ahead. The music began. Ethan closed his eyes, took a breath, and started to sing. His voice was clear. Not technically perfect, he was 12, and his voice was still developing, still breaking in places. But it carried something that technique couldn't teach. It carried loss and love and the desperate need to make a dead man proud. "When I am down and oh my soul so weary." The audience was transfixed. Not because of vocal acrobatics or show-stopping range. Because of truth. Because every word Ethan sang came from a place of real grief and real hope. Simon stood at the edge of the stage, arms folded, but not in his typical judgmental stance. He was holding himself together. His jaw was tight. His eyes never left Ethan. "You raise me up, so I can stand on mountains." Ethan's voice cracked on. "Mountains," the emotion overwhelming him for a moment. He faltered, his hand gripping the microphone tighter, and for a second it looked like he might not be able to continue. Simon saw it. That moment where grief almost wins. Where the promise almost becomes too heavy to carry. And he did something he'd never done in 20 years of judging talent shows. He started walking up the steps to the stage. The cameras scrambled to follow him. The producers were shouting into headsets. The other judges stood up, not sure what was happening. Terry Crews watched from the wings, his hand over his mouth. Simon walked onto the stage, walked right up to Ethan, and stood beside him. Ethan looked up, startled, his singing stopping mid-phrase. "Keep going," Simon said quietly, just to him, though the microphones caught it. "You're not alone. Keep singing." And then Simon Cowell did something that would be replayed millions of times, analyzed and shared and remembered as one of television's most human moments. He put his hand on Ethan's shoulder and stood there with him while Ethan finished the song. Backstage, producers were begging him to continue, but he didn't. The control room was chaos. "We can't have Simon on stage during the performance. This breaks every protocol. We need to." "Shut up," the executive producer said quietly, staring at the monitors. "Just shut up and keep rolling." On stage, Ethan was singing through tears, his voice wavering but pushing through. Simon's hand stayed on his shoulder, steady, supportive, a physical reminder that he wasn't carrying this alone. "You raise me up to more than I can be." As Ethan hit the final note, his voice breaking with emotion but making it through, the audience exploded. Not polite applause. Not even enthusiastic applause. A roar. 3,000 people on their feet, screaming, crying, applauding not just for the performance but for the courage, for the promise kept, for the moment they'd all witnessed. Simon kept his hand on Ethan's shoulder for a moment longer, then crouched down to the boy's level. "Your father would be so proud of you," he said, and his own voice was thick with emotion. "You kept your promise. You did it." Ethan dropped the microphone and wrapped his arms around Simon's neck, sobbing. Simon Cowell, the judge who had made thousands of contestants cry with harsh critiques, who had built a career on being tough and unflinching, held this 12-year-old boy and let him cry on live television. The camera operators were crying. The crew members were crying. Howie, Heidi, and Sophia were all standing at the judges' table, applauding with tears streaming down their faces. But what happened next, no one in the theater, or watching at home, could ever forget. When Ethan finally pulled back, Simon took a handkerchief from his pocket and handed it to him. "Ethan, I'm going to give you my feedback now. And then the other judges will give theirs. But I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say." Ethan nodded, wiping his eyes. "You came here today to honor your father. To keep a promise. And you did that beautifully. Your performance wasn't perfect. Your voice cracked. You struggled in places. And none of that matters even a little bit." Simon stood up, looking directly at the boy. "Because what you showed us today was more important than perfect technique. You showed us what it means to be brave when everything inside you wants to give up. You showed us what it means to keep a promise even when it breaks your heart to do it. And you showed us that your father raised an extraordinary son." He paused, then said something that made the entire audience gasp. "There are 4 judges on this panel. But tonight, you only need 1 vote." Simon walked over to the judges' table. He looked at Howie, Heidi, and Sophia. "This isn't a normal audition. This is a boy keeping a sacred promise to his dying father. So I'm asking you all to trust me on something." He turned back to Ethan, still standing alone on the massive stage, looking small and vulnerable and impossibly brave. Simon placed his hand on the golden buzzer. "Ethan Miller, your father told you to get on this stage and show us what you could do. You did more than that. You showed us what love looks like. What courage looks like. What keeping promises looks like." His hand slammed down. Golden confetti exploded from the ceiling. The audience went wild. Howie, Heidi, and Sophia rushed the stage. Terry Crews was openly weeping as he ran to embrace Ethan. But Simon stayed at the judges' table, watching as the stage filled with golden confetti, as Ethan was surrounded by people celebrating him, as the promise was fully, completely kept. Share and subscribe, so this story will never be forgotten. After the show, Simon did something he'd never done before. He asked to meet with Ethan and his mother privately, backstage. They sat in his dressing room, Simon, Ethan, and Sarah Miller, Ethan's mother, who had been sitting in the audience crying through the entire performance. "I want to tell you both something," Simon said. "My father died when I was building my career. And I spent years wishing I'd told him how much his belief in me meant. Ethan, you don't have that regret. You told your father. Through your performance tonight, through keeping your promise, you told him. He knows." He pulled something from his pocket. A small card. "This is my personal phone number. Not my assistant's. Mine. If you ever need anything, advice, help, just someone to talk to about missing your dad, you call me. Understood?" Ethan took the card with trembling hands. "Why are you doing this?" "Because 25 years ago, I was you. Standing alone, trying to be brave, trying to make a father proud who wasn't there anymore. And I didn't have anyone tell me it was okay to be scared. I'm telling you, it's okay to be scared. It's okay to miss him. It's okay to cry. But you keep singing. You keep that promise alive. Deal? Deal." Simon shook his hand, not the handshake you give a child, but the handshake you give an equal, someone who has earned respect through courage. 3 months later, Ethan performed in the America's Got Talent finals. He didn't win the competition. But that didn't matter. Because on the night of his audition, something bigger than a talent show happened. A boy kept a promise to his father. And Simon Cowell, the judge famous for crushing dreams, reminded the world that sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is stand on a stage and sing through your tears. Ethan still has Simon's card. He's never needed to use it. But he carries it with him everywhere. Just like he carries his father's promise.